The night I first slept in that farmhouse, I lay on a bare mattress I dragged from a storage closet and stared at water stains on the ceiling, listening to the pipes knock and the wind come through the gaps in the window frame. I was 63 years old. I had no idea yet what that old house was worth, and I remember thinking, if my daughter-in-law could see me right now, she'd feel vindicated. She'd call it a dump. Not to a friend, not under her breath. To my face, in my son's kitchen, 3 days after my husband's funeral. Let me go back to the beginning, because that's the only way any of this makes sense. My husband Gerald and I had been married for 38 years when he died. He had a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March while he was making coffee. I was in the shower. By the time I got downstairs, he was already on the floor. The paramedics were kind. They did everything they could. But Gerald was gone before the ambulance reached the hospital, and I drove home alone from the emergency room at 11 in the morning on a day that was too sunny for what had just happened. Gerald was a quiet man who kept things close to his chest. That was something I loved about him for 30 years and found frustrating for the last 8. He handled all of our finances. The mortgage, the retirement account, the insurance. I was a school librarian for 26 years. I understood budgets in the abstract, but Gerald always said he'd take care of the numbers. I let him. I shouldn't have. What I didn't know, what I found out 3 days after his funeral, sitting at the kitchen table with our son Prescott and his wife Aubrey and a lawyer I'd never met, was that Gerald had updated his will 18 months before he died, and he hadn't told me. Our home in Columbus, the four-bedroom house where I'd raised Prescott, where we'd had 32 Thanksgivings, where my rose bushes lined the front walk, had been put into a joint living trust with Prescott. Gerald's pension would transfer to me. The savings accounts were mine. But the house itself, upon Gerald's death, would become Prescott and Aubrey's property. I didn't understand it at first. The lawyer explained it twice. Prescott sat with his hands folded on the table and didn't look at me. There was also the farmhouse. Gerald had inherited it from his uncle Leonard years ago, before Prescott was born. It sat on 42 acres in rural southeastern Ohio, near a small town called Colebrook. We'd driven out there once, maybe 15 years ago, just to look at it. The farmhouse was old and needed work. Gerald had always talked about fixing it up someday. Someday never came. He'd been paying a minimal property tax on it for decades, and occasionally mentioned it the way people mention things they intend to deal with eventually. The farmhouse was left to me. Prescott got the Columbus house. I got the farmhouse. I sat there at that table and felt the room tilt slightly, the way it does when you realize you've misunderstood something fundamental about your own life. Aubrey had been my daughter-in-law for 6 years. She was 31, worked in pharmaceutical sales, and had the particular confidence of someone who has always gotten what she decided she wanted. In the early years, I tried. We'd had lunches together, exchanged Christmas gifts, texted occasionally, but she had a way of looking past me when we spoke, not rudely, just with mild disinterest, like I was a piece of furniture that had been in the house when she moved in. After Gerald died, I stayed in the Columbus house. Prescott invited me to, said it was fine, take whatever time I needed. That lasted about 6 weeks. One Sunday afternoon, I was looking through some of Gerald's things in the garage when I heard Aubrey and Prescott talking in the kitchen. The window was cracked. I wasn't trying to listen. She was saying she'd been talking to a realtor, that the market was strong, that if they were going to sell, spring was the right time. Prescott said he hadn't talked to me about it yet. Aubrey said, and I remember this clearly, I've replayed it often enough, she has the farmhouse. Gerald made sure she had somewhere to go. 3 days later, a Prescott came to find me in the garden. He sat on the porch steps and stared at the yard and told me, in the careful voice he'd used since he was a teenager to deliver news he expected me to receive badly, that they were going to put the house on the market. He said I could take whatever I needed from it. He said they'd help me move. I asked him where he expected me to go. He said I could move to the farmhouse. He said it would be quiet out there, peaceful, that I might like it once I settled in. I asked if he'd ever actually been inside it. He admitted he hadn't, but he'd driven past. I went inside and didn't say anything else to him that day. The following week, Aubrey was in a generous mood. She helped me sort through some things in the living room, folding Gerald's sweaters into boxes. At some point I said, more to myself than to her, that I wasn't sure what kind of shape the farmhouse was in, that I'd have to see whether it was livable. She didn't even look up from what she was folding. "I'm sure it's fine, Vera," she said. "It's probably exactly what you need. Simple, quiet." She paused. "Honestly, it fits you. You've always been more of a countryside person." There was something in her voice. Not malicious, exactly. Just dismissive. The kind of tone that tells you what someone actually thinks of you more clearly than any insult could. I didn't respond. I went back to packing. I drove out to Colebrook on a Wednesday in early May with my sedan packed to the roof and a list of everything I thought I'd need for the first month. The drive was 2 hours and 20 minutes. The last 20 minutes were on county roads that I'd printed directions for because my cell service cut out somewhere past the highway exit. The farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel lane, set back from the road by a stand of old oaks. It was white with green shutters, or had been once. The paint was peeling. The front porch sagged on one side. One of the upstairs window screens had come loose and was hanging at an angle. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long moment. Then I got out, found the key in the lockbox the county recorder's office had told me to look for, and went inside. It smelled like dust and closed-up air, and something faintly sweet that I later identified as a wasp nest in the wall of the back bedroom. The kitchen faucet dripped. The water heater was an original that had no business still running. The linoleum in the kitchen had lifted at one corner, but the bones were solid. The floors were oak, original, probably from when the house was built in the 1920s. The ceilings were high. The windows underneath the grime were good-sized and let in real light. The fireplace in the living room was intact. I made a list. I always make lists. I always make lists. That first night, I dragged a mattress from a storage closet, put clean sheets on it, and lay there listening to the house settle around me. I wasn't happy. I wasn't peaceful. I was 63 years old, and I was sleeping in a farmhouse I'd visited once in my life, in a town where I didn't know a single person, because my husband had rearranged our future without telling me, and my son had let his wife's ambitions matter more than my stability. But I was there, and I was going to figure it out. The first person I met in Colebrook was a man named Roy, who ran the hardware store on the main road and spent the better part of an hour walking me through what I'd need to seal the windows before the following winter. He was 70, retired from farming, and had the particular patience of someone who has given a lot of tutorials to a lot of people who didn't know what they were doing. He didn't make me feel stupid. I appreciated that. The second person was a woman named Petra, who lived on the adjacent property, or what I thought was adjacent, though the parcels out there were far enough apart that neighbor meant something different than it had in Columbus. Petra was 68, had lived in Colebrook her whole life, and within 2 weeks of my arrival had brought me a casserole, a bag of vegetables from her garden, and a piece of local knowledge that would change everything. She told me that a land surveying company had been through the area over the past year, that they'd been looking at parcels along the county road, including what she believed was my property line. She'd seen their trucks, had assumed they were doing road work, but a man from the county auditor's office had told her no. They were doing geological assessments. I didn't think much of it at first. I filed it away. A few weeks after that, I received a letter. It was from a company called Meridian Resource Group. It was addressed to the property owner of record, which was now me, and it expressed interest in discussing a mineral rights lease agreement regarding my property. I had to look up what that meant. What I learned after several hours of research and a phone call with a woman at Ohio State's Agricultural Extension Office who was exceedingly patient with my questions was that southeastern Ohio sits on top of significant natural gas formations. Landowners in the region had been approached for years about leasing the mineral rights below their property, rights that, depending on the parcel, could be worth a substantial amount. I read the letter again. Then I put it in a drawer and didn't tell anyone. Over the next several weeks, I had conversations I hadn't planned on having. I called a lawyer, not the one from Gerald's estate, a different one, a woman in Athens, Ohio, who specialized in property and mineral rights, and had a matter-of-fact telephone manner that I found reassuring. Her name was Claudette. She told me not to sign anything, not to respond to Meridian directly, and to let her review the situation. I didn't sign anything. Claudette came to the farmhouse in late June. She walked the property with me, looked at the documents, and explained my options. The mineral rights had been included in Gerald's Uncle Leonard's original deed, which meant they transferred with the property. They were mine entirely, unencumbered. Meridian wasn't the only company interested. There were two others. Claudette advised me to get an independent geological assessment before any negotiation. I got the assessment. The numbers it returned were not what I'd expected. I won't give the exact figure. That's not something I'm comfortable putting out there. But I will say that the potential value of those rights, over the term of a reasonable lease agreement, was more than Gerald and I had saved in 38 years of working. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about Aubrey folding sweaters and saying the farmhouse fit me. I thought about Prescott on the porch steps, looking at the garden instead of at me. I thought about Gerald updating his will without a conversation, without so much as a heads up, as if I was someone to be arranged rather than consulted. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something more complicated than that. Prescott called in July. He called fairly regularly, once a week or so, with a dutiful rhythm of someone fulfilling an obligation he wasn't sure how to feel about. The calls were short. He asked how the house was coming along. I told him. He said it sounded like a lot of work. I said it was. This particular call was different. He'd run into someone at a party, a man who worked in real estate development, who'd mentioned that there was a lot of activity in southeastern Ohio around land deals, mineral leases, that sort of thing. Prescott said casually that he'd been thinking about the farmhouse, that it might be worth looking into whether there was any value in the property beyond the structure itself. I waited a moment before I said anything. I said the house was in better shape than I'd expected. He said that wasn't exactly what he meant. He said he'd be happy to look into it on my behalf, that he had some contacts who might be able to evaluate the situation. I said I had things handled. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd talked to a lawyer, just informally, not officially, about whether the mineral rights might have been intended to transfer differently, given the way the estate was structured. I set down my coffee mug on the kitchen table very carefully, so I wouldn't slam it. I told him that I had retained my own legal counsel and that I was confident the ownership was clear. Prescott said he wasn't challenging anything. He just thought it was worth exploring. I said I hoped he understood that I had spent 2 months repairing plumbing and scraping 60 years of paint off window frames in a house I'd been handed like a consolation prize, and that I did not need him to arrive now that the situation might be interesting. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Mom, I'm sorry about all of it. I handled this wrong." I told him I appreciated him saying that. I meant it. But I also told him that his apology and his interest in the mineral rights had come in the same phone call, and that I was going to need some time before I could fully separate the two. Aubrey was another matter. She called about a week after Prescott did. I hadn't spoken to her directly in nearly 2 months. She started with pleasantries. How was the area? Had I settled in? Was the weather nicer in the country than in the city? She was using her warmest voice, the one she deployed for people she was trying to get something from. Then she said that she and Prescott had been discussing the farmhouse, and she wondered whether I'd ever thought about the long term, whether I considered that the upkeep might become difficult as I got older, whether it might make more sense financially to look at the property as an asset that could benefit the whole family. I said, I'm 63, not 93. I'm not planning my incapacity quite yet. She gave a light laugh. She said of course she didn't mean anything by it. I told her that I'd received correspondence regarding the property, and that it was being handled by my attorney. The warmth in her voice shifted. Not gone, she was too controlled for that, but recalibrated. She asked who my attorney was. I said I didn't think that was relevant to our conversation. She said she was just asking as family. I said that family was an interesting word, given how the past several months had gone, and that I wasn't prepared to have this conversation yet. She said she hoped I wasn't being unreasonable. I told her I hoped she had a nice evening. I hung up and stood in my kitchen and looked out the window at the back field, where the wildflowers Petra had told me about were just starting to come in along the fence line, red clover and Queen Anne's lace. Gerald would have liked them. Claudette negotiated on my behalf through the fall. 2 companies made offers. A third came in later with a different structure. She was thorough and unhurried and explained every clause of every draft in plain language. I signed the agreement in November, sitting at the table in the farmhouse kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold beside me and the oak floors creaking slightly in the draught from the back door. By then I had replaced the water heater, had the porch relevelled, patched and repainted the exterior, and had a new furnace installed before the first hard frost. Petra had helped me find a handyman named Gil who was honest and reliable, and whose truck I recognised at this point the same way I'd recognise a friend's car. The farmhouse was starting to feel like mine. I had also started doing something I hadn't done in years. I was reading, not in the distracted, half-present way I'd been reading since Gerald got sick. Actually reading, full books, whole afternoons. I'd found a small library in Colebrook, the kind that's housed in a converted Victorian with radiators that clang, and a librarian who's been there long enough to know where everything is without looking. I volunteered on Thursday mornings. It was the best part of my week. I wasn't who I'd been when I arrived. I wasn't the woman who'd sat in her car in the driveway wondering if she'd made a mistake. I still missed Gerald, not the Gerald who'd rearranged my future without consulting me, but the one from before, the one who'd known how I took my coffee and had kept a paperback on his nightstand for 30 years. You can miss a person and also be angry at them. I'd made my peace with holding both. Prescott drove out in December. He called ahead, asked if he could come. I said yes. He came alone. Aubrey was not with him, and he didn't explain her absence, and I didn't ask. He walked through the farmhouse slowly, looking at things without commenting. He stood on the re-level porch and looked out at the back field. It was cold and grey, and the oaks had lost their leaves, and everything looked a little bare. He said, "You've done a lot." I said, "It needed a lot." He was quiet for a minute. Then he said he'd been doing some thinking, that he'd had conversations with Aubrey that had not gone well, that he was starting to understand some things about the past few years that he hadn't seen clearly before. I didn't ask him to elaborate. I poured 2 cups of coffee and we sat at the kitchen table and I waited, because he was clearly working up to something. He told me that Aubrey had hired a lawyer, separately from him, without telling him to look into the estate. He'd found out when the lawyer's office had called the house asking for documents. He'd asked Aubrey about it. She'd been unapologetic. She'd said she was protecting their interests. He said he'd asked her whose interests she meant. The conversation had apparently gone on for several hours and had not ended well. I listened to all of this without saying much. I handed him a dish towel when his voice got thick. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt the particular tiredness that comes when something you suspected for a long time is confirmed. I told him I wasn't going to alter any of my legal arrangements, that what was mine, and I had secured it appropriately, and I expected it to remain that way. He said he understood. I told him that he was my son and that I loved him, and that part of loving someone is being honest with them, and that I needed him to understand, really understand, not just acknowledge, that the way the past year had unfolded had hurt me. Not just the house, not just the legal manoeuvring, the way he'd sat at that table after Gerald's funeral and looked at the floor. The way he'd told me about the Columbus house while staring at the garden. The way he'd waited until the property might be valuable before calling to express any real concern. He nodded. He didn't defend himself. He said, I know I did that. That was enough for then. It wasn't a resolution. It was a beginning of one, which is different, and which I've learned to value appropriately. Aubrey and Prescott separated in February. He told me in a phone call, briefly, in the careful voice. He said he wasn't sure what would happen. I told him I was sorry, and I meant it. Not for her, not particularly, but for him, because, whatever she'd been, he'd loved her, and loss is loss, regardless of whether it was coming. He asked if he could come for Easter. I said of course. I made the same lamb roast I'd made every Easter since Prescott was 7. I found the recipe in a box I'd packed from the Columbus house. Gerald's mother's handwriting on an index card, stained at the corner. I used the good china I'd brought with me, which looked perfectly fine on the old oak table in the farmhouse kitchen. We ate without talking much. Afterward, we sat on the porch, even though it was still a little cold, and Prescott had his hands wrapped around his mug and was looking at the field. And I was thinking about Gerald's uncle Leonard, who I'd never met, who'd bought this land and kept it and left it in the family, not knowing what it held or what it would eventually mean to someone. I said, your father was complicated. Prescott said, "Yeah." I said, "But he left me something real, even if he didn't tell me what it was." Prescott looked at me. I think he understood that I wasn't just talking about the property. The mineral rights agreement pays out quarterly. The first check arrived in March. I sat with it for a long time before I deposited it. Then I made three decisions. The first was that I would fund a small scholarship at the Colbert Library for kids in the county who wanted to study library science or literature. I don't have a grand sense of legacy. I was a school librarian in Columbus for 26 years. That's not an identity that comes with monuments. But books had been the one constant in my adult life, and it seemed right. The second was that I would have the farmhouse roof properly replaced and the barn at the back of the property repaired. I didn't know yet what I'd do with the barn. Maybe nothing. Maybe something. I was in no hurry. The third was that I would stop spending any part of any day wondering what Aubrey thought of me or what she'd say if she knew. Because here is the thing about being told that something fits you when it's said as an insult. Sometimes it's simply true, just not in the way they meant it. This land fits me. This quiet fits me. The drive to Petra's on a Sunday afternoon, the Thursday mornings at library, the way the field looks in early October when the light goes low and everything turns gold. It fits me in a way that a life built around other people's choices never did. I am 64 now. Gerald has been gone for a year and a half. I still drink my coffee in the morning at the kitchen table, and sometimes I look at the chair across from me and feel the weight of his absence. And sometimes I just look at the window and think about what I have to do that day. Both things can be true. That's something I know better now than I did before. The farmhouse is mine. The land is mine. The life I'm building here, slowly, on my own terms, with my own hands, mine. I don't need anyone to look at it and call it valuable. I already know. I've thought a lot about what it means when the wrong people feel certain they know exactly what you deserve. Aubrey never hesitated. She heard farmhouse in rural Ohio and made her calculation in under a second. Worthless property, worthless woman, problem solved. That kind of certainty is its own undoing. When you dismiss someone completely, you stop watching them. You stop paying attention. And that's precisely when people like me, people who were never flashy, never loud, never the ones demanding to be noticed, get very quietly busy. I didn't set out to prove anything. That's the part I want to be clear about. I didn't move into that farmhouse plotting some kind of reversal. I moved in because I had nowhere else to go and because, underneath the grief and the exhaustion and the very real fear, I still had enough of myself left to believe that doing something was better than sitting still. That's not bravery. That's just stubbornness with better posture. But I think about the choices that led to where I ended up, and I see the logic in them, even the painful ones. Gerald kept things from me. The will, the finances, the updates he made without a conversation. And that secrecy cost me. But his uncle Leonard, a man I never met, bought 42 acres in southeastern Ohio and held on to them for decades without knowing why. And Gerald, despite everything, left those acres to me, not to Prescott, to me. Whatever his reasons, that decision changed my life. The consequences of choices echo forward in ways the person making them can't always see. And Aubrey's choice to treat me like something to be managed and discarded had its own consequences. Not because the world punishes cruelty on some divine schedule, but because the kind of person who is capable of that dismissal is also capable of overplaying their hand. She moved too quickly, assumed too much, and by the time she realized the farmhouse was worth fighting over, I had already retained Claudette, already received the assessment, already understood exactly what I had. She gave me the time I needed by not taking me seriously. That is its own kind of justice, and it requires no outside intervention. Prescott is harder to think about, because I love him, and because love makes clarity more difficult. What he did, sitting at that table looking at the floor, letting it happen, was a failure of character that I don't think he fully understood until it was too late to undo. He's not a bad man. He's a man who chose comfort over courage for too long, and who paid for it in ways that had nothing to do with property. The marriage ending, the phone calls where he didn't quite know what to say, those were the natural results of a pattern he'd built, not something imposed on him from outside. What I know now, at 64, living in a farmhouse I've repaired mostly with my own decisions, if not always my own hands, is that resilience isn't a feeling, it's a practice. It's waking up in a strange house where the pipes knock and deciding to make a list. It's calling a hardware store and asking for help and not being embarrassed about not knowing. It's understanding that intelligence isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to find them. One phone call, one document, one question at a time. The farmhouse fits me. She meant that as an insult. I've decided to take it as the most accurate thing she ever said.